Alright guys, how's it going? It's been an interesting couple of weeks on the technology front, and it all kicked off on the 8th of May at Nvidia's GPU Technology Conference, or the GTC, with the keynote once again delivered by Nvidia's CEO and founder Jensen Huang. Now the keynote was 2 hours and 15 minutes long, and being kind, I will say that it was interesting in parts, especially early on in the presentation, where he talked about life after Moore's Law, while having a dig at Intel and their 10% improvement every year. Around 20 minutes in, we got our first glimpse of what Nvidia is calling Project Holodeck, which is pretty interesting but looks more like a natural evolution of VR. You've got a bunch of people in different rooms, different parts of the world, all hanging together in a virtual world. The demo itself was a little bit scratchy, but the technology looks pretty nice. Especially the part with the car where we see it obeying the laws of physics, like here for example, when the driver's hands touch the steering wheel. Nvidia are pretty good at this kind of thing, and I just expect this to get better moving forward. Around 25 minutes in though, we got to the real reason most people were here, and that is of course machine learning or deep learning. GTC has been mostly about deep learning for the past 3 or 4 years, and it's pretty much the vast majority of what Nvidia talks about these days. But it all started to feel just a little bit samey to previous GTCs. We're seeing the same kind of demos over and over. Sure, they're getting faster, but that would be the point of the technology. But there were one or two other interesting things. One thing that resonated with me was how much better captioning or voice translation was. This is something I noticed on my channel a few days ago when a viewer pointed out to me that the captions were really good. Now obviously when you've got an accent like mine, a lot of people struggling to pick it up, and I do get asked a lot if I can provide subtitles, and the old Google subtitles were absolutely awful. But if you take a look at them now on my Prey video, they are really good. It's not 100% perfect, but it's 95% perfect now, I would say, compared to what was probably around 20%. Not that long ago. So it's very interesting to see how machine learning has helped in this area. For somebody like me, this is obviously a big deal. All of this deep learning and machine learning stuff, it might seem apparently rather useless to many people, but it's always good to see that in some cases, this can actually make a real difference. And that's a good example, and one we can all clearly see. But moving on to the real big news, which was of course the introduction of the new Tesla Volta, a giant leap for artificial intelligence and high-performance computing. Volta with the new Tensor Core, looking at the specs, 21 billion transistors, fabricated on TSMC's 12nm FinFET, and a monster 815 square millimeters. Now, looking at the specs, this 12nm thing seems mostly like marketing. The really interesting part is the mammoth 815 square millimeter die size. This thing is massive, absolutely huge. If you remember, the previous Pascal P100 was 610 square millimeters. So this is a 33% larger die size, which goes way beyond what I believed was the reticle limit on 16 nanometers. And I believe that this is probably the point of this 12nm. There doesn't appear to be any real improvement in the individual transistors. However, it may be the case that Nvidia has paid TSMC, the company that manufactures all of their graphics chips, Nvidia may have paid this company to increase the reticle limit, which basically allows for even larger chips to be made. And the reason they've done this is there was nowhere left to go. GP100 was already 612 square millimeters, which in itself is absolutely massive. So long as we're still on 16 and 14 nanometers, the only way to get faster is to get bigger, and that is what they have done here. So it does look like this 12nm FinFET thing is just marketing, and it is almost certainly just 16 nanometers, perhaps with 1 or 2 tweaks in there as well, but mostly with an expanded reticle which allows an even larger GPU to be manufactured. The rest of the specs are 5120 CUDA cores. That is up over 40% compared to the previous P100 3584 CUDA cores. Double precision has increased 42%, up from 5.3 to 7.5 teraflops, with single precision increasing by the same. And finally, the new 120 tensor teraflops from the addition of around 600 plus tensor cores. And looking at those rather impressive specs, are even more impressive when you realise that this is not the full Tesla V100, it's actually chopped by 5% from the full GV100 die, which at maximum would have 5376 CUDA cores. Something this size is always going to have horrendous yields. and I doubt that we will ever see the full version. But yeah, it is a mammoth 300 watt GPU, and of course it's not a gaming GPU, and it never will be. According to Nvidia's CEO, that was the work of thousands of engineers costing over $3 billion in research and development over multiple years. One thing I did find interesting was the massive level 1, the massive register file at 20 megabytes, even bigger than the cache. So this could be interesting in terms of Volta on the desktop. The stuff like these tensor cores you're not gonna get. Now obviously it also comes with HBM2, of which there are 16 gigabytes, but you're not gonna see that on the desktop either. It's all interesting stuff, especially from an engineering perspective, but again, unless you're deeply interested in deep learning, there's not a great deal here for you. Around an hour into the presentation, I really was starting to get pretty bored, and something that Jensen said really did resonate.
Well, that's Volta, that's V100. And let's go through a couple of quick demos. You know, you guys know that it's a GPU, so although I haven't spoken much about graphics, it is able to do graphics.
A little bit of a giggle there when he realised that, yeah, Nvidia was at one point a graphics company before they became an AI company. I watched it for another 5-10 minutes. There was an interesting galaxy simulation. I think it's an N-body simulation, where we saw the Andromeda Galaxy and Milky Way merging together at some point in the future. We've seen similar demos to this. I believe AMD did one years ago as well. And in fact, I believe that Nvidia did one at a previous GTC. Like I said, it's all mildly interesting stuff, but I simply couldn't watch it anymore. Halfway through it and I just switched it off. We got the details on Volta. A lot of you were clamouring for me to talk about it, and there you have it. It's not a gaming card. We learned nothing about it in terms of gaming. As far as I'm concerned, Volta GeForce will simply be Pascal with GDDR6. I did believe at one point it would come with HBM2, but HBM2 is clearly way too early still for a company of Nvidia's size. I do not believe Volta GeForce will come with HBM2, but I could be wrong on that. Right, so that's me done with Nvidia for now. So moving on to AMD and their 2017 Financial Analyst Day. It's an opportunity for Lisa Su and a bunch of AMD SVPs to give a talk to investors on current and future products. I watched almost all of this. It was quite a bit more interesting. They were talking about graphics and Ryzen, not just on the desktop, but also the new server CPU, Epic, which is of course based on Ryzen. And there was a bunch of other interesting stuff, of course. We know that Threadripper is coming, 16 cores, 32 threads on the desktop. All of this stuff I will talk about in a future video. But right now, for this one, we're going to concentrate on Raja Koduri's presentation, which was, of course, very much about Vega. It was a very candid presentation where right at the very start, Raja basically admitted that AMD had lost focus on discrete graphics.
You know, we lost focus on discrete graphics. I won't go into all the reasons why, but in some sense, if you even go back 5 years, many folks wrote off discrete graphics. They said discrete graphics is going to be dead, it's all integrated, mobile is going to take over, and all. And a lot of people believed that. Roadmaps changed, focus changed, investments changed.
So that's quite an admission, although not one that maybe comes as a huge surprise to people who are closely following the industry. There were, of course, many reasons for that. And like Raja said, 5-6 years ago, an awful lot of people in the industry believed that discrete graphics were going away, that they would be replaced by integrated graphics. That simply has not materialized, and we can see that because Nvidia continues to go from strength to strength. So Raja's initial part of the presentation was basically him saying that AMD has now got their eye back on the graphics ball. The Radeon Technologies Group, which was formed 18 months ago or so, was really formed for this reason. And we can see here that they have 3,000 plus employees, 3,000 engineers, and that's around about 1/3 of the company, and not a small amount of people. Now, even though Vega has been developed for the machine intelligence age, it does appear to differentiate from Volta when it comes to data sets. This is simply about AMD utilising their advantage in HBM and Vega's high bandwidth cache and high bandwidth cache controller. That's something we're going to hear an awful lot about because it's something that nobody else in the industry has, and this is likely to be where AMD tries to press their advantages over the rest. It wasn't long though before we had moved on to enthusiast gaming. Starting off with a couple of demos, which has helped us to zero in on Vega's performance. Before that though, let's go back to January when AMD first demoed Vega. We saw it running Doom, and it's safe to say that I was not impressed. From what we could tell, Vega was running Doom around 10% faster than a GTX 1080, which was nowhere near as fast as what many people were expecting. Now, there were mitigating circumstances, for example, immature drivers. Clock speeds maybe weren't quite as high as final silicon clock speeds would be, and it's a development board, that type of thing. But my reasoning back then was that this is probably very close to final silicon, and that yes, while drivers would improve, I would not expect to see a huge change. And my belief was that the fastest consumer Vega would probably fall short of the GeForce 1080 Ti. So we saw one or two other demos as well, for example in Star Wars Battlefront, but these were locked at 60 frames per second, so we couldn't tell how fast they were running. Then it went a very long time before we heard anything. Months went past, in fact, without what I consider to be a single good leak. That was until earlier in the month where we saw a Vega 3D Mark Firestrike result with what looked like a very conservative clock speed of 1200 MHz on the core and 8GB of memory at a 700 MHz memory clock. Before that, we had also seen a Time Spy benchmark with the same 1200 MHz clock speed performing around about the GeForce GTX 1070 level, with a score of around 5,700 points. And a lot of people simply did not believe it because this score is maybe only 10% faster than Fury X, yet with a 14% clock speed advantage. Now that may not look very good, but obviously people are now expecting much higher clock speeds than 1200 MHz. My thinking when I saw this was that this is probably the Vega Nano, which for me is likely to become the most efficient graphics card in terms of performance per watt. So that explains the 1200 MHz and slower memory than we had anticipated. But I did consider these to be legitimate leaks and another good indication of Vega's ultimate performance. So getting back to the Financial Analyst Day, and Raja showed us a benchmark of Sniper Elite 4, running on DX12 at 4K resolution. The sequence starts with the frame rate appearing to be around 65 frames per second. However, a few seconds into it, it does appear to dip below 60 frames per second, just briefly. When he reaches the wall, the frame rate rises to between 70 and 80 frames per second. Again taking a dip at the top of the wall, down below 60 frames per second. And as he kneels down, we can see the frame rate around 62, 63 frames per second. Now, as usual, somebody managed to dig up a video of a GTX 1080 Ti at the exact same spot in the game, running a 7700K at 4.5 GHz. And as you'll see, the 1080 Ti was overclocked to 1962 MHz. So that's a fairly hefty overclock over the boost clock of around 1582 MHz. But of course, that's the official boost clock, and most 1080 Ti's will run quite a bit higher than that. And instantly we can see, right at the very start, 79 frames per second, compared to what was around 65 frames per second on the Vega card. The 1080 Ti dips to around 68.5 frames per second at the same point where Vega dipped below 60 frames per second. And at the wall again we can see that we are generally closer to 80 frames rather than between 70 and 80 like on the Vega sample. Kneeling down though, it's around about the same 63-64 frames per second. But overall you have to say that, at best, the Vega sample we see here is probably around 10% slower than this, admittedly quite highly overclocked 1080 Ti. So maybe not too bad, but it's also important to realise that Sniper Elite 4 runs very well on current AMD hardware. We can see here that Fury X is not that far behind the GTX 1080 and is a mile ahead of both the 980 Ti and the GTX 1070, more than 20% ahead of the GTX 1070. That's at Guru of 3D. Over at Tech Power Up, we see the same story. Fury X not far away from the GTX 1080, and some distance ahead of both the 1070 and the 980 Ti. Again, DX12 Ultra settings at 4K. If you just remove that 20% from Vega, then it does look like, unfortunately, it will be some distance behind the 1080 Ti in the normal game. And I think we're looking closer at the GTX 1080, in fact, much like what we saw in Doom. And there's more, because we saw a high bandwidth cache controller demo running Tomb Raider. This was the most interesting demo for me, simply because it showed the high bandwidth cache. What they have done is artificially limited the Vega sample to 2 GB of VRAM while running the Tomb Raider inbuilt benchmark at 4K. So they've put 2 Vega samples up against each other, on the left with high bandwidth cache off, and on the right with the high bandwidth cache on. Both cards at 2 GB of VRAM, remember, and on the left hand side with the high bandwidth cache off, we can see that, especially in minimum frame rate, the Vega sample is really struggling, as you might expect. 4K, 2 GB of VRAM, you would expect minimum frame rates to be very poor. On the right hand side, however, with the high bandwidth cache on, the minimums remain pretty high. And this is really what the high bandwidth cache is all about. Raja claims that it effectively doubles to quadruples the amount of memory available to the graphics card. And for sure, this is really good technology, but they've had to manufacture this benchmark because there is no load currently that requires 8 GB of VRAM and also the ability of the high bandwidth cache controller. So this benchmark's kind of been manufactured to show what a potential future usage of the technology is. Now, I went over all this in my last Vega video months ago. And again, yeah, it's great, but right now, the high bandwidth cache controller probably doesn't do an awful lot in most games. More interestingly though was, just looking at the numbers again, I ran Tomb Raider on my own GTX 1070, running around 2 GHz, so a pretty hefty overclock on that one as well. And my results show Vega around 30% faster in both average and minimum frame rate. 30-40% faster than GTX 1070. That leaves us around about the middle of the 1080 Ti range again. And you have to say that now there is an awful lot of evidence pointing to that gap. A bit later on, we see some real strengths of Vega. Using the SSG, which is the solid state drive on the graphics card, we see that it is very strong in ray tracing, and of course very good in professional work, editing, 8K, that kind of thing. And later on, of course, AMD finally starts talking about machine intelligence, which is what a lot of these guys are here for, mostly because of what Nvidia has done over the past 3 or 4 years. And it's safe to say that until this point, AMD has been absolutely nowhere. But Raja claims that this is all going to be changing with Vega, and Ryzen of course, as both chips do of course complement each other very well, and we do see a benchmark, Deep Bench, where Vega easily defeats the current P100, the Pascal Tesla, which is the current champion of this benchmark. That's for almost 50% faster? That's a lot. Whether or not we see this reflected elsewhere, we simply don't know yet. But overall, it was an interesting presentation, very candid, very upfront, I felt, about the issues that AMD's graphics division has faced over the previous years. The benchmarks could not be clearer. Vega simply will not beat the 1080 Ti. Now, Raja did say at the Reddit AMA that there will be faster RX, in other words, faster consumer graphics cards than this Vega Frontier Edition, which they had been using in the benchmarks. But forget about any idea of it being much faster. We're talking a similar situation to what the Titan X and the 1080 Ti is. We will probably see higher clock speeds on the consumer Vega, but it's likely going to be a chopped down graphics card instead of the full die. The full die will go to the professional segments and the data center. The consumers will get the chopped down version, higher voltages, higher power draw, maybe overclocks a little bit better, but ultimately you're talking maybe 1 or 2% faster than what we were shown in Sniper and in Tomb Raider. Thinking back to when I did the GPU War is Over video and then followed up with the Vega videos, a lot of people are just in denial over those videos, but this is the reality. I don't cover every single thing because there could be an overwhelming amount of information, but I saw all of this stuff coming because Nvidia had so much money now, and what they have done is they have split their GPU lines into consumer and into high performance. So stuff like your Pascal P100, your Volta V100, that $3 billion's worth of R&D that Jensen keeps talking about, that's where all that money goes, into their emerging AI market, and the consumers get Maxwell rebranded into Pascal. Now sure, Maxwell's a great architecture, very fast, and Pascal was even faster. And Volta will be even faster because it will be bigger. It's unlikely that Nvidia will get higher clock speeds out of the same process, but they can afford to pay TSMC for their own custom process. And whether or not Volta GeForce will be this 12 nanometers, I simply don't know. But regardless of that, Nvidia holds all the cards. They can create that consumer GPU. That's what your 1080 Ti is, your GTX 1080. Pure consumer GPUs, it's got none of all this tensor stuff. None of these cards can do double precision to save themselves, but they do game very, very fast. And Nvidia gets an awful lot of money from these cards still. Way more from gaming than from anything else. AMD, on the other hand, had to use the same architecture for both consumers and both high performance. And up until Vega, this was very much slanted towards the consumer side. This is why they were still able to hang in there with Nvidia, in gaming terms, for a long time, up until Maxwell, in fact. If you remember the 290, the 290X, they came in and they beat the old Titan and pretty much tied with the 780 Ti. It was only after Nvidia created Maxwell that AMD struggled to close the gap, and they were a mile behind in performance per watt. Polaris isn't that far away from Pascal, but that was very much based on the old GCN type of architecture, just a lot more efficient. Vega, on the other hand, Vega is built for the data center, it is built for AI, it is built for large data sets. The high bandwidth cache controller is the sort of thing that will be absolutely fantastic going forward. This is about saving money though, because rather than putting 16 and 32 and 64 gigabytes of HBM on a graphics card, the high bandwidth cache controller should effectively let AMD away with half the amount. The problem here, of course, is it is about saving money because AMD simply cannot command the same prices for graphics cards that Nvidia can. Nvidia doesn't need a high bandwidth cache controller. They'll just stick on 16 gigabytes of HBM, then stick another $300 on the price of the graphics card, and people will pay it. There's no need for all this great technology when you can just brute force everything, and that is effectively the way Nvidia won. The one last hope for AMD is the master plan. Infinity Fabric, multiple graphics cards in one package, but this has to act as one without developer involvement. AMD just keeps on creating these future architectures, and it's a future that never seems to be realised. And at the end, we saw the Radeon Vega Frontier Edition, the picture of a mountain, which I thought was very apt, because they have got a mountain to climb, and then some, before they are even close to Nvidia again. In the end, I got over this months ago. Vega's going to have great technology and it will be at a competitive price. It's just a sad fact that gamers are second tier. We're not even second tier anymore. We're just bottom tier. We get the scraps left over from the data center, and that simply came about from a lack of competition. All Nvidia needs to do is rebrand Maxwell over and over, and that's what they'll do. AMD, on the other hand, need to chase the money. The data center is where these cards will sell, and they will probably do very well. But if you're waiting on AMD beating Nvidia, card versus card, at least in single chip terms, then you're going to be waiting a very, very long time. I'll catch you later, guys.